Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Rob. And I was hoping half of the bio would be deleted for the introduction for this particular celebration today. But nonetheless, thank you very much. Acknowledging President Ian Callanan ACKC and incoming President Alan Myers ACKC. And I would not be the Deputy Leader of the Liberal National Party in Queensland if I didn't give a wonderful shout out to one of our candidates in the room, Amanda Stoker, our candidate for Oodgeroo. So thank you, Amanda. Ladies and gentlemen, can I welcome you to Queensland? I know the Leader of the Opposition, David Christodoulou, will be welcoming you officially tonight to his patch on the Gold Coast. I'm from the Sunshine Coast, but I want to welcome you to Queensland, the strongest state that returned the biggest no vote on the recent Voice referendum, and we are very proud of that. Robin, I also know that I'm the last speaker of the day of what has particularly been a big day for you all, and I'm the last speaker between you and pre-dinner drinks. So, Robin, I will attempt to make you available for your pre-dinner drinks and not miss out on anything. I want to also say that the topic of discussion, when you look through the topics of discussion today and the eminent people you've had speaking, and of course Professor James Allen who just spoke, and Professor Allen, I can assure you, when you talk about the coalition, we're not a coalition in Queensland, we're the Liberal National Party, and there are some of us with values, and which I'm going to get to in just a little moment. And despite the raging war from the left, there are some of us in Queensland that battle the fight every day and take it up to the left wokeism in the state, which has, from time to time, got me in all sorts of trouble, particularly when I walked out of my local university, the Sunshine Coast University, when the national anthem was not only played but sung, and they changed all the lyrics. And when I walked out and then rang the newspaper and told them how the disbelief I was in that the university where I'm from on the Sunshine Coast would be, changing the names to the lyrics to the national anthem, the university responded that the national anthem does not fit with contemporary Australia. So they just decided to change the national anthem. And it was the last time I visited the university, and that was some 10 years ago. Hopefully they don't do it anymore, but that is one of the fights we must have. So in the program today, it talks about what I'm going to speak about, and it wasn't the human rights or the Bill of Rights we have in Queensland, but I can address that topic as Professor Allen raised it. But it says some reflections on recent events, which is quite a broad subject, which is fantastic, because when the Australian contacted my office yesterday, we had Parliament all sitting this week, and the Australian contacted the Leader of the Opposition in my office yesterday and wanted copies of our speeches, because the Labor Party made a song and dance in the Parliament during the week that David and I would be attending this conference this weekend and speaking with Amanda Stoker. And apparently we're hanging out with some conservative folk from around Australia. The Labor Party made a big deal of it in Parliament. But then when the Australian asked for copies of my speeches, my office quite rightly said, well, that would be very difficult because Jarrod rarely reads from prepared scripts, so we can't send it, so you'll just have to wait and see. And then I realised we're being recorded, so we'll absolutely be in the Australian. What I want to talk about today is a few battles we've had over the last few years, and talk about my support for competitive federalism. And when we absolutely must, as a state, and as you would not be surprised me saying this as a state member of Parliament, stick it to the Commonwealth and say no thank you. And I know I see my good friend Bev here, does it all the time in the Legislative Council as well, so thank you for travelling up here, Bev. Great to see you as well. Bev and I are in the Monarchist League, National Monarchist League, together and fight the good fight there. I want to give a few examples of where we have fought back on a few issues over the years, but to do that, I note that Jeff Kennett spoke at this very convention, it's going to be a concert tonight, I can assure you, this very convention 31 years ago, and he said this. A few weeks ago, and I quote, I attended the Premier's Conference in Canberra. Most of the morning of the day, the meeting was devoted to set-piece presentations by the Prime Minister, the Premiers and Chief Ministers. I made the point to the gathering about the absurdity of sitting around a table making statements which appeared to be solely for the benefit of the assembled media. He goes on and says, I made the suggestion then, and repeat it now, that Australia would be better served if the Prime Minister, Premiers and Chief Ministers locked themselves away for a few days without all the officials and media hounds and got down to the business of finding workable solutions to the many national problems. Of course, he says, my proposal received the response we've all come to expect from the seasoned, cynical Canberra political commentators. Yet when one looks back at the first National Australasian Convention in 1891, one of the most notable events was when some of the key participants representing the colonies of Australia, including Samuel Griffith, locked themselves away for several days on the Hawkesbury River on the Queensland Government's steam SS Lucinda to negotiate the course which led to the Federation and ultimately the development of a nation of which we can all be proud. Now, those were Jeff Kennett's words. You're in Queensland. I can't offer you the steamship, the government yacht Lucinda anymore, because the only relic we have is actually sitting in Queensland Parliament, and we have the Lucinda Bar, where we partake in drinks every night. But we're more than happy to host you at any given time, again at the Lucinda, at the bar at Parliament House. But you ask yourself the question, when Jeff Kennett made those remarks 31 years ago for COAG, what's changed? Well, I think it's got worse. We now have a national cabinet. And I would see in the last few years since the national cabinet's been established, I ask myself the question, Australians better off for this national cabinet? Is competitive federalism better off because of this national cabinet? And I think the answer to that is no. A few examples of why I think it's not working, why we must, as a state, and you'd expect me to say it as a state politician, although we have state colleagues around the country that far too often are happy to secede power to the Commonwealth, whereas I think we should, based on our constitution, be reluctant to give that away. Our leader spoke recently at the Cedar lunch, and he was asked a question by a businessman. And the question was along the line, Mr. Crisafulli, we have got an election in a few months' time in Queensland, ours is in October this year. One of the biggest issues we had is red tape and regulation, and we want it reduced. But what we want to do is not only have it reduced, we want it across the country. We want national regulation and not state-by-state regulation and red tape. And David's answer to that, which surprised the assembled, was absolutely not. Because if you were just going to cede all this power continually to the Commonwealth, the question begins, what is the purpose of the states? When we said that to the business people, we then say this. If you want competitive federalism to truly play out, you've got to be better than the other states. You've got to have less regulation, less red tape, more innovation, and businesses will want to flock to the state. And that's why, and I'm sorry for our New South Wales and Victorians and everyone who is not a Queenslander, we want to be better than the other states. And I don't have the view that if one state's doing it poorly, we should all just follow suit. We want to do it better. And so a few of the issues I want to raise today. When I became Attorney General in 2009, was put on my desk by the department, as those who've served, and Amanda will know this as well, and the other members of Parliament in the room, the public servants gave me a document. It said, Mr. Attorney, the first thing we need to do is nationalise the legal profession. And I said, why would we want to do that? And they said, oh, well, it will give these X, Y benefits. And I said, yes, and what's the costs? What's the cost to the host jurisdiction, which is the host jurisdiction, by the way? How will it reduce regulation and red tape? Because my experience is when we nationalise things, regulation and red tape builds up. Of course, having not received those answers, and admittedly the Law Society did not support the national regulation until the Liberal National Party won government, then they changed their view. And then I announced we're not going ahead with it. So we said no, and we did not proceed with the national regulation. And when I said at the time the national scheme was not in the best interest of the Queensland legal profession as a whole, particularly for the sole traders and smaller businesses, the national legal reform creates an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy which the state doesn't need, and these reforms will require the establishment of a national board to regulate the national legal profession, adding an unnecessary level of regulation and red tape. The cost of setting up was vague, so I absolutely said to the department, no, we're not proceeding with the national legal professional reform. And then, of course, you can imagine all the big firms, they spat the dummy and said this is terrible, and after we announced we weren't proceeding with it, not many other jurisdictions did. Victoria and New South Wales were keen on it, and Western Australia wasn't. So it did not proceed. So when we talk about how we have these battles, we can fight back against some of the Commonwealth desire to intervene in state affairs. We also had the National Vehicle Heavy Regulator come before us when I was a Cabinet Minister, and I obviously not going to disclose what happened before Cabinet, but it was a big decision the Cabinet had to make whether we would introduce the National Vehicle Heavy Regulator in 2013. Now, we did take the decision to do that in 2013, and all these years later, they're still reforming it, still tweaking it, still working it out, although the broader trucking industry and associations are supportive of the national regulator now. But it wasn't as easy as everyone had to do, and I think we've now debated 4 separate bills in Parliament to fix some of the issues that were first designed in 2013. The other one we had was organised crime. We had bikies running amok across the country. South Australia, New South Wales had introduced some anti-association laws. South Australia, Labor government had introduced some anti-association laws. And I said at the time whether Queensland would introduce those laws just to copy South Australia. And I want to quote what I said at the time when we opposed this particular piece of legislation with the Labor Bleijie government introducing it. I said, we should be leading the way, but we do not need to lead the way when it comes to encroaching on the freedoms and liberties of our people. The Bleijie Labor government has a history of copying legislation and other material from its southern counterparts. I've said in this place before that it's a sad state in the history of politics in Queensland when this government looks to the, with no offence please, looks to the southern state for the answers, in particular New South Wales, as a great example of legislative reform. Now, for the New South Welshmen in the room, I was actually born in Griffith, New South Wales, so I think I can say that. However, the irony, a few years later, I introduced my own reforms when I was the Attorney-General and Minister for Justice, and they were somewhat stronger than the South Australian laws and did impede people's liberties and freedoms, but that was the anti-association laws, which were dubbed the VLAD laws in Queensland, the Vicious Lawless Association Disestablishment Act, and the other relevant anti-association laws at the time. Because you're all at the Gold Coast, we had a particular gang warfare at the Gold Coast at the time with the bikies, the Bandidos and Hells Angels, and we did take the necessary steps. But we led the charge on that regard, and then South Australia did copy Queensland laws. In fact, John Rowell was the Attorney-General at South Australia at the time, who said Queensland had got the magic pudding right with respect to our organised crime laws, which did survive a partial challenge in the High Court, I might add, where other jurisdictions had failed. The other one we had in 2009 was industrial relations law. This was a bill we opposed. The Liberal National Party opposed these laws. This was just after I was first elected in 2009, one of the first bills we debated was the Fair Work Commonwealth Powers, which scares me every time I see a bill in the Queensland Parliament, in brackets Commonwealth Powers, and other provisions bill. And it was a bill to refer the state's industrial relations powers for the private sector to the Commonwealth. And it was basically to put nationalise the industrial relations sector for private sector employers in Queensland. We actually opposed that on the basis that we believe the state could better represent small business sole operators and partnerships in Queensland rather than nationalise law. Unfortunately, the Labor Party proceeded with that. When we look at how we fight these and fight back against the, because it is very easy for state governments just to nationalise things, and they just want to give the Commonwealth because then it's out of their hands and they don't have to worry about it. But I think we have to on most occasions, fight back against that easy way out of a lot of issues we have in the country. And when we talk about that, we obviously look at our constitutional supremacy, not Parliament, constitutional supremacy, which I know your association fights for, as it did in The Voice. And if you take The Voice for the perfect example, Professor Allen talked about the few in the room that did go public, particularly in the bar at the time of The Voice. And the reason I think a lot of centre-right political members of Parliament, barristers, lawyers, don't is because they see the hell that ensues on the individual after they do open their mouths. You see it on the campuses. We saw it with a particular gentleman in this room wrote an opinion piece against The Voice, and a particular bar council was quite adamant that view was not the view of the Bar Council in that particular jurisdiction. So there is hate out there to have the views that we do on the conservative side of politics. If you look at The Voice particularly, Australia is not like Britain, where Parliament is supreme. In Australia, our constitutional text is supreme. And it was disappointing in that context to see the Prime Minister think he could so easily adjust the constitutional text, which would have, you all know, far-reaching ramifications. So I'm so particularly pleased that Australia overwhelmingly voted against the voice. And as I said, in Queensland, 68%, I think it was just over 68% voted against the voice in Queensland. Now, on to other matters. I have been in Queensland described as the young fogey. Now, that was when I was Attorney General, when I was 29, and I'm now 42, but I think the Labor Party in Queensland would still describe me as somewhat of a young fogey. But I want to reflect on a couple of issues we had in government and that I've been preaching since, in terms of our constitutional monarchy that we have and the system of government we have, which I think has served Australia well, and we should not change it, and we should fight hard against any changes to that. And I'm reminded of a 2008 article that Professor Anne Toomey wrote, "The States, the Commonwealth and the Crown, the battle for sovereignty, the Australia Acts 1986, and the sovereignty, a battle won." In essence, this was about Section 7.5, or Section 7, then Section 7.5 of the Australia Act, which talked about whether the states could negotiate and give advice directly to the monarch or the sovereign. And there was debate around the time of the Australia Acts of 1986 whether that would in fact take place. The Fraser government argued, and this is in Professor Toomey's article that I'm quoting from, the Fraser government argued the Commonwealth ministers should replace the British ministers advising the Queen on state matters. Of course, the states didn't like that, wanting to do that directly. The Hawke government, referred to as the post box. The Hawke government wanted the Governor-General office to be the post box for states ministers to go through the Governor-General's office directly to the Crown, but not the state to the Crown, to the sovereign. Buckingham Palace was concerned at the time if there was a conflict between what the Commonwealth was giving advice to the Queen about and what the states were giving advice to the Queen about. Sir Anthony Ackland, the Foreign Office at the time, wrote to the Queen's private secretary, which did, and I will quote, he said, "As we see it, the relationship of Her Majesty with the government or governments of a country which she is Queen is a matter of that country's domestic affairs. Australia as a whole is independent. When the United Kingdom bows out, the government of that independent country will comprise all Australian governments, Commonwealth and state. In other words, independence and sovereignty will not be the prerogative solely of the Commonwealth ministers." So on that basis, you would see my surprise when I was the Attorney General and we wanted to write to the Queen about some things like naming the new court building the Queen Elizabeth II Courts of Law. And when we did that, the Governor's office in Queensland said, no, we'll have to do it through the Governor-General. I said, but we have a governor in Queensland. And Section 7.5 of the Australia Act says that the Premier gives the advice to the Queen. And I want to read you a letter that is not ever been published and is not available publicly anywhere. Fell off the back of a truck, I still have a copy of it. This was the draft letter proposed to be prepared from the Governor of Queensland's office to the Governor-General's office with respect to our submission on a matter that our Premier at the time wanted the Queen to have in front of her. And the letter concluded by saying, this is to the Governor-General's Chief Secretary, "In accordance with current procedures, I seek your assistance in having this correspondence transmitted to Her Majesty for consideration." And when I got this draft letter, I said, what on earth are we going, why on earth are we bundling all this up and sending it to the Governor-General? We have a governor in Queensland, and the Premier wants the advice and the thing we were seeking for consideration for the Queen's consideration, we want that to go through our governor directly to the palace, not through Canberra. Anyway, argy-bargy proceeded because the department, the only explanation they could offer me was, we've always done it. And I said, well, we're not doing it anymore. We're not going through the Governor-General. We are going through our governor. The Premier will give the advice. So we did that on a number of occasions. Now, in conclusion, I want to just quickly talk about, because I know we are a little over time today, but I want to talk about a few things we did in Queensland, where I talk about there are many politicians in Queensland, in the Queensland Parliament, on the Liberal National Party side, that do defend our constitutional monarchy, they defend the Crown, they defend our institutions. They want to see cultural change in our institutions. We need it in our schools, we need it in our judiciary. It's interesting if we talk about, as Professor Allen did, about judicial activism. In Queensland, they were very active. Some were very active between 2012 and 2015, and despite in the last 10 years where we've seen the Labor government with some pretty serious attacks on judicial independence, more so than I ever saw between 2012 and 2015, the judicial activism seems to be less in the last 10 years, despite the direct attacks on the judiciary. I'll leave that one there. So, I was the second youngest Queensland Attorney General, and would you believe it, the only one that peeped me was Sir Samuel Griffith himself. In 1874, he was the Attorney General, and he beat me by about 3 months. He then, of course, went on to a lot of great things, and I then have served the last 10 years in opposition. But that didn't stop me when I was the Attorney General. We did a few things. You would know that we reintroduced Queen's Counsel. We wanted to rid senior counsel from the book, so we reintroduced Queen's Counsel. I note that the Commonwealth and Victoria followed our lead after that. I looked recently, and I think New South Wales are still considering it. Since we introduced it in 2012, I think New South Wales is still considering it. But I'm just reminded that South Australia has actually got a bill before it at the moment to abolish KCs. It's passed, has it? So that's South Australia followed our lead by reintroducing QCs at the time, now KCs, and unfortunately South Australia new government is abolishing them. We changed the logo from the Queensland Government logo back to the traditional coat of arms, and when we swore in Justices of the Peace, we gave them a certificate which was their oath of office and allegiance. Because would you believe it, our Justice of the Peace that served such a great role in our justice system in Queensland were given a certificate with what we dubbed at the time the Beatty Burger. And I don't know if you ever recall it in Queensland. If you're not from Queensland, you will know. It was this sort of weird burger with these lines going through. It looked like a McDonald's sort of McChicken with sort of squirted sauce all over it. That was the government logo. And we were giving our Justices of the Peace, that was their certificate. So we changed it. We put the traditional coat of arms on all government documentation. I had the pleasure of opening the Queen Elizabeth II Courts of Law, and in negotiation discussion with the Chief Justice de Jersey at the time, we did make a submission and transmit that to the Queen to honour her, Queen Elizabeth II. That's why, and it's such a process to go through our Governor at the time. The Premier makes the submission, gives the advice to the Queen, the Attorney General at the time. I wrote the letter supporting it, the Chief Justice. We had a letter from the Bar Association, the Law Society, and that all gets bundled up, and we put a lot of effort and work into it. And it goes to the Palace, it goes before the Sovereign, and they simply put their initials on the same letter from the Premier and send it back by facsimile and email, and it was done. The Queen had approved the Queen Elizabeth II Courts of Law, which was an honour to cut the ribbon on that. We also, and this was a fun one, we also reintroduced the Royal Succession Laws. Now, this came about because in the UK, the law was that if you were firstborn child of the monarch, the sovereign, and you were female, but then you had younger brothers, they would accede to the throne. Now, we changed the laws to make it that if the firstborn was a female, it didn't matter if it was a female or male, that was the sovereign, coming in sovereign. The Commonwealth came to us and said, don't worry, we'll just do it at a Commonwealth level on behalf of all the states. And we said, no, we'll do it, because we just saw so much delay. So in 2013, I introduced the Royal Succession Laws, which was the first jurisdiction in Australia, outside of the United Kingdom, in all the Commonwealth countries, to introduce those laws, and they were particularly in Queensland. So it firstly allowed a firstborn female, if she then had younger brothers, that she would become sovereign, but it also allowed a sovereign to marry a Catholic. It didn't change the law that a Catholic couldn't become sovereign, or a non-Protestant. That's still the law, but it allowed the sovereign to marry a Catholic if that was the case. That was the two elements in our law. And also we had, in our term in government, we had Prince George was born, and we had wonderful birth certificates in honour of Prince George. Now, the Labor Party give me a lot of grief. Even last week, they gave me grief time and time again for being so, why am I so fascinated in the monarch? And I'm not fascinated in the monarch. I'm fascinated and a true believer in our constitutional monarchy and our fundamental of institution, and I don't want it changed. And that's why I do what I do, and I speak in Parliament about these things. And if that means honouring our sovereign in a way that was fitting for the Queen, who served the Commonwealth and the world, the Commonwealth realms and territories for 70 years, then so be it. We've had a debate in Queensland recently where we announced 2 years ago on the death of the late Majesty that we would name a rail line after the Queen, the Elizabeth line, which we announced 2 years ago, but somehow the ABC only found out about it 2 weeks ago, and it's become a big issue in Queensland. The leader of the opposition, David Crisafulli, and I stood there at the future exhibition station where the RNA is, the Royal Show in Queensland. We announced it 2 years ago, but as I said, 2 weeks ago, a journalist from the ABC contacted us, and then it became this big issue. And then the Guardian got onto it as well, which was it blew up, and it was like we'd never announced it. But anyway, that's the things we're going to do. So we need to protect our institutions. We need cultural change in our institutions. You'll hear tonight, if you're going to the wonderful dinner from our leader, Crisafulli, about why we need to change the government in Queensland in October, because we're not going to get the institutional change. We're not going to get the things we need to change in Queensland. And we see that if we can change the government in Queensland, that'll be the start of many jurisdictions to change. And then if we can change other jurisdictions around the country, including federal government, then I think then we can protect our institutions. And I take the point from Professor James Allen earlier that yes, the coalition and other jurisdictions with Liberal and national governments have to do better, absolutely, at protecting those institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today, and enjoy dinner. Thank you.